Welcome in, everyone. I'm Josh Larkey. This is the Dominator. Week 15 starts at edition. We've made it. We've made it to the fantasy football playoffs. Hopefully, you'd be a real sick bastard to listen to a show like this when you've already been mathematically eliminated from the fantasy football playoffs. So welcome in. Let's get right down to it. I've got a lot of players for you today. Quarterback. And you might be like, Josh, why do you have so many players? Folks, we're done with buys. Finally. We had 6 buys last week. Finally. Teams are off buys. There's a plethora of options. This week at quarterback, my favorite start of the week is Tua Tagovailoa. Fantasy Pros consensus quarterback 9 at the Texans. Texans are the 9th best matchup. Opposing fantasy quarterbacks, when you adjust for how good they are and you schedule adjust and whatnot, Texans are the 9th best matchup. Quarterbacks average a little over 1 fantasy point per game above their season-long average. But I think Tua can boom here. Since returning from injured reserve, Tua's played in 7 games. He's averaging 282 passing yards, more than 2 passing touchdowns per game, and over 20 fantasy points per game during that 7-game span. He's trying to keep Miami's slim playoff hopes alive in a great matchup. It is Tua Tagovailoa week. It is also time to start Justin Herbert. Consensus quarterback 11 versus the Buccaneers. It was really unfortunate. Lad McConkey was a surprise inactive last week. He was practicing last week. They don't play him. Herbert does very little with very little. There was nothing there. I mean, even Will Dissly was getting hurt during the game. That was when Will Dissly getting hurt mid-game is a big blow to your team and to your offense. You know the playmakers are lacking. He should get Lad McConkey back. And the Buccaneers are the number 1 defense to target for quarterbacks in fantasy this year. Fantasy quarterbacks averaging 4.5 more fantasy points per game than their season-long average against the Buccaneers. After 2 disappointing weeks, it's time to fire up Justin Herbert once again. And then stream. You want a deep streamer? Stream the man. He's probably on psychedelics right now. He doesn't even know what day it is, but come Sunday, he'll be ready. Stream Aaron Rodgers, Fantasy Pros consensus quarterback 21 at the Jaguars. Jaguars are the 2nd best matchup for opposing fantasy quarterbacks. Rodgers is coming off of a 339 passing yard game against Miami last week. Miami is a much tougher opponent. If you're desperate, you can bet on back-to-back strong games from Aaron Rodgers with the matchup. Turning to running back. Start Chuba Hubbard. Fantasy Pros consensus running back 9 versus the Cowboys. And I always try to make this show actionable. And you might be like, Josh, wait, why are you telling us to start the running back 9? I do this because I have this decision myself in a few leagues. And that's not to brag and say, oh, that team is so good at running back. It's more so, this is what can happen. I have a few teams where you took Chuba Hubbard late, and some of your like middle round running backs, like a Joe Mixon and Alvin Kamara, those guys kind of hit. And then suddenly you're like, wow, I've got a plethora of good options. Wow, that's the 2nd time we've used that word on the show today. The producer in my ear saying, nobody knows what that means. Stop saying it. Anyway, I think some of you out there with Chuba Hubbard actually have a decision to make. I have a couple of decisions to make with Chuba in my roughly 30 leagues, and I'm starting him each time. So he faces the Cowboys. I was concerned last week with Chuba Hubbard because of Jonathan Brooks and his increasing role. We took the Chuba Hubbard lowers. He was actually incredibly inefficient. He was averaging like 3.5 yards per carry. He did not actually do very well efficiency-wise, but when the backup running back it's a sad situation. When the backup running back re-tears their ACL on their first carry of the game, you better bet the starter is going to have a ton of touches. That's what Chuba Hubbard did. 26 carries, 92 yards, and a touchdown, 5 targets. He caught 4 of them for 15 yards against a tough Eagles defense. Now it's the favorable matchup with Dallas. A bell cow workload's incoming. He's coming off of 30 touches last week. Could happen again. There's actually one spot where I'm starting him over Alvin Kamara myself. I've got Bijan Robinson. I've got Chase Brown in that league. And I'm going to go with Chuba Hubbard as my RB3. Put him in the flex over Alvin Kamara, who has Jake Haener at quarterback for him. A little bit concerned with that Saints team. That's a free sit for you in the start column. Is not that I think Alvin Kamara is a sit, but in that case, I am truly starting Bijan, Chase Brown, Chuba Hubbard, Alvin Kamara. You can ride the bench, old man. I actually think I'm older than Kamara. I'm allowed to make that joke. That is for everyone out there getting frustrated. It's okay. It's okay. We will start Rico Dowdle, consensus running back 15 at the Panthers. That's another one I got wrong last week. I faded Rico Dowdle. It was not injury. I can't blame it on a Jonathan Brooks injury. I just got that wrong. The Cowboys hung with the Bengals much more for longer than I expected in that game. It ended up being an incredibly fun back and forth affair. Game script was just fine. Rico Dowdle now has at least 19 touches and 98 yards in 3 straight games. Underdog Fantasy has the total yards over under for Rico Dowdle at 100.5. Expectations are sky high. We should be starting him. Carolina is the best possible matchup for fantasy running backs. Running back rooms average 6 fantasy points per game above their season-long average against the Panthers. Expect a workhorse role for Dowdle. He's just taken over this backfield. He's taken it over. It's time that we pay attention. We just start him every week. Start him every week now. I think he is too many touches. And then start Aaron Jones, consensus, running back 19 versus the Bears. Bears are the 4th best matchup for fantasy running backs this year. You can run on the Bears quite easily. Jones now has at least 82 yards or a touchdown in 7 of his past 8 games. He feels disappointing. He's actually just been fine. We just haven't gotten too many ceiling games from him. I think this could be the ceiling game where Darnold in the passing game steals the spotlight last week. 350 passing yards, 5 touchdowns against Atlanta. Atlanta is definitely a pass funnel defense. Atlanta's run defense is pretty good. Pass defense, atrocious. The Bears, they've been struggling the last few weeks with their pass defense, but all season, you can simply run on this team. We'll dig a little bit deeper. Start Rachaad White. Consensus running back 24 at the Chargers. Bucky Irving did not practice on Wednesday. He did not practice on Thursday. I'm recording this Friday morning. I'm going to assume right now he does not practice on Friday, given that he was limping around in week 13. Then they say he's going to play in week 14. He gets injured extremely early in week 14. The back injury reflares up. I think it's in their best interest to sit him. He hasn't practiced this week. Assuming that happens, Rachaad is just an absolute smash. Chargers defense is tough against the run. Let's get that out of the way. But usage matters at the running back position. Rachaad White is getting the usage, and he's actually been quite good this season for fantasy. 17 carries, 3 targets last week versus the Raiders. I'd expect slightly fewer carries, probably, slightly more targets. Tick, 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 tick. Uptick on those targets. Given the matchup, it's the Chargers. Week 7 onward, since the Evans and Godwin injuries, oh boy, Rachaad White is the RB8 in fantasy points per game with 17.5. Nobody tells you that stat. Nobody knows that stat. Nobody knows Rachaad White the way I do. He was my only friend. All right, getting back to it. We should be starting Rachaad White. And then you want the Hail Mary. The Hail Mary, we're going deep for the Hail Mary. Jeremy McNichols, running back 48 by consensus at the Saints. I had to give you someone that is literally available everywhere. It's McNichols. So the Saints tied for the 4th best matchup this week with the Bears. Running back rooms average 3 fantasy points above their season-long average against the Saints. Commanders are more than touchdown favorites. Jake Haener's quarterback for the Saints. The Saints have no healthy receivers. I think it's going to get ugly fast. Commanders are fresh off their bye. I think McNichols could get just enough mop-up duty here. If you need a desperation punt play for 6 to 10 fantasy points, I think he can get you that. I think he can get you that. He might get in the end zone. He just might. Folks, before we hit receivers, all of my fantasy rankings, quarterback, running back, receiver, tight end, flex, they are on Twitter at JLarky Tweets, on Blue Sky at Josh Larkey. They are nowhere else. You can always suggest a social media platform. Maybe I'll put them there as well, but you can check them out. You can see how I am exactly feeling about a lot of these players, but I know not everyone has time for that. Not everyone has time when they're commuting in the car to look at a cheat sheet. They do have time for this podcast, and for the Dominator, I thank you. Receiver. Start Ladd McConkey. Consensus wide receiver 22 versus the Buccaneers. Tampa Bay is an above average slot matchup. If we like Herbert, we're probably going to like his number one receiver. McConkey is averaging over the past 6 games, 6 catches, 92 yards a game. He practiced last week and then he didn't play. He's practicing again. He should return this week. I have him significantly ahead of consensus. Another guy I really like, start Khalil Shakir, wide receiver 29 at the Lions. Every time I tell you to sit Shakir, he fucking pummels me. I am done. We are no longer on this show. We no longer play games with Khalil Shakir. The man is having himself a great season. Detroit's been an elite slot matchup this year. Apparently, unless your name is Jaden Reed in week 14. Reed had over 100 yards against the Lions the first time he played them. Week 14, brutal, no catches. Now, the Lions-Bills game has an insane 54.5 point game total. That's insane. I would not overthink a player like Khalil Shakir here. I would simply start Khalil Shakir in an excellent matchup, excellent game environment. Over his past 7 games, he's averaging 8.5 targets, more than 6 catches, and 70 yards per game. We're also going to start Jalen Waddle. Consensus wide receiver 31 at the Texans. I think he's in a great spot. Texans are a top 10 matchup for fantasy receivers. Waddle, he's finally heating up. At least 99 yards, at least 20 fantasy points. 2 of his past 3 games. We've got the high over under here as well, 46.5 points. Start AdamThielan. Consensus hates him. I don't know why. Consensus has him at wide receiver 37 versus the Cowboys. Now, it's a roughly average slot matchup against Dallas. But what Thielen has done since returning from injury is anything but average. He was eased back from injury in week 12. He catches 3 passes for 57 yards against the Chiefs. Week 13, Thielen, welcome to the big show. Welcome back, old man. Thielen is older than me, so I could get in trouble legally for that old man. Anyway, week 13, 10 targets, 8 catches, 99 yards, touchdown. Easy matchup against the Buccaneers. Week 14, he faces the NFL's best overall defense, the Eagles. 11 targets, 9 catches, 102 yards. Bryce Young, since returning from his benching, has played in 6 games, and he's taken only 8 sacks. That's about 1 sack per game. That's ridiculous. That is so good. Bryce Young is playing the best football of his career. He's keeping drives extended and alive. He's not taking the sacks, and it allows Thielen to rack up the fantasy points. The Cowboys' pass rush is always a concern, but I think Bryce Young is uniquely qualified to mitigate it. Given that he's been a decisive, quick passer, he's got a good offensive line now, and Bryce Young looks like an above-average NFL quarterback right now. Crazy to say. Got one more. We're going to dig deep. Got a deep cut at receiver. Wide receiver 45 by consensus. Elijah Moore versus the Chiefs. Now, hear me out. Chiefs are the 6th best matchup for slot receivers. I am calculating that when I do my opponent adjusted matchups on Twitter at JLarky Tweets, on Blue Sky at Josh Larkey. When I do my opponent adjusted matchups, I'm calculating by guys classified as a wide receiver. So that actually undersells the Chiefs' struggles in the slot. Brock Bowers had 8 catches, 106 yards from the slot, specifically against the Chiefs. Isaiah Likely had 5 catches, 79 yards, touchdown from the slot. George Kittle had 78 yards from the slot. Essentially, the Chiefs have done well on the outside, but they've struggled more in the middle of the field. Elijah Moore has boomed in 3 of his 6 games with Jameis Winston this year. 8 catches, 85 yards, 6 catches, 66 yards and a score, 8 catches, 111 yards. He's got 3 great games with Jameis. If you need a widely available receiver for a Week 15 spot start, Elijah Moore has true upside here. Tight end. We're going to get through the tight end starts, and then I've got the sits for you, and I've got 3 underdog fantasy picks I'm excited about this week. Start TJ Hockenson, consensus tight end 7 versus the Bears. If he's on your fantasy team, you probably have another option at tight end as well because you drafted Hockenson late. I'm seeing people rank Sam Laporta ahead of him. I would disagree. I do not want to bet against Hockenson when the Bears have struggled against tight ends all year. Think about, even last week we saw it again. George Kittle, 6 catches, 151 yards against the Bears. Start Hockenson. Stream Hunter Henry. Consensus tight end 11 at the Cardinals. Consensus, they're finally catching up. Hunter Henry's playing well recently. Basically, since Drake May took over. Hunter Henry in this 8-game span is averaging over 7 targets and over 5 receptions and 54 yards per game. 11.5 fantasy points per game, too. That's a lot of fantasy points, despite 1 touchdown over that 8-game span. And then stream, here's the deep cut. As a Chargers fan, stream, Stone, Smartt. The create a player of create a players. Stream, Stone, Smartt. Consensus tight end 30 versus the Buccaneers. Hey, Will Dissly, shoulder injury. He's out a couple weeks. Stone, Smartt caught all 3 targets for 54 yards last week versus the Chiefs. The Buccaneers are the 7th best matchup for tight ends. There's just not much. There's just not much after Lad McConkey for target earners in this Chargers offense. Quentin Johnston, Josh Palmer, they're more inconsistent with their target earning. Stone Smartt is a good, widely available pivot for frustrated David Njoku fantasy managers who just found out he will not be playing this week. Stone Smartt, you can look him up on Player Profiler. He's an undersized tweener tight end, but he has a similar 40 time to Travis Kelce. He at least has a little bit of juice to him. He's just not really built like your traditional tight end. But for fantasy, hey, if I know that a guy's probably too undersized to block and he's fast, sometimes we just start that guy in fantasy football.
Hey, I know it's a popular statistic to cite, these underdog pick'ems, the vast majority of people go more than on any given player. Yeah, close to 80% of people, but that's because it's easier to find the shootouts than it is to find the dud games every Sunday afternoon. Like we knew week 5, Ravens-Bengals was going to be a shootout. And there goes Lamar Jackson for 4 touchdowns. There goes Joe Burrow for 5 touchdowns. Derrick Henry gets there. Zay Flowers is over 100 yards. Jamar Chase and T. Higgins both got there, as well as Chase Brown. Both Chases got there. You go more than, you 100x your payout on Underdog with their Pick 6 contest. But then you look at Dolphins Patriots, that's going down the toilet, right? Too bad Ramondre Stevenson at 18 fantasy points. But you improve your chances at positive returns when you correlate with these Underdog pick'ems. Use promo code Underworld. This is the biggest bonus Underdog has ever given out, up to $125. Promo code is Underworld. Put in $250, you get $125. Now go start picking.
Welcome back, folks. I'm Josh Larkey. This is the Dominator. We are here with Player Profiler. Just a heads up, I usually get to the questions in the chat. We do not have time for that today. As I mentioned, my fantasy rankings: quarterback, receiver, running back, tight end, flex. At JLarkey Tweets on Twitter, at Josh Larkey Blue Sky. If you want, you can always ask me some questions there. You might be like, what's going on today? Well, folks, we got a special edition. For those watching live, after this episode ends, a few minutes later, the 200th episode of Wake and Take, Jason Allwine, special guest, Theo Greminger. That will be live for you. Make sure you're tuning into the 200th. That's a monumental episode. This is episode 41 of the Josh Larkey Dominator experience. 41 is not 200. All right, back to it. Let's hit you with some sits. Now, this is a controversial one. It's hard to concoct sits when there's just so many good options and there's a lot of good game environments. I've got two for you. They feel gross, but I'm going to say it anyway and stand behind these. I am sitting Jared Goff versus the Bills. Consensus quarterback 13. I've seen a lot of people asking me about him. They want to start him. Let's talk about it. So I'm betting against a 54.5 point over under here. Kind of. So the Bills are actually the 25th matchup for fantasy quarterbacks. They're one of the worst. They're 25th. What is that? 8 from the bottom, I guess, because it's 7. 32 minus 25 is 7. Then you have to add 1 for rankings. 8, they're technically the 8th worst matchup. How's that for on-air math? 8th worst matchup. I think the Buffalo D should bounce back a little bit after getting embarrassed by the Rams last week. And the Bills are a run funnel defense. Jahmyr Gibbs, David Montgomery, they have great matchups here. Jared Goff has reached 17 fantasy points in less than half of his games this year. I think there's higher floor options out there compared to Jared Goff this week. And the betting markets agree. Betting markets have him at 255 passing yards and 1.5 passing touchdowns. True over under there. It's not like they think he's throwing for 3 touchdowns and 300 yards. He could do that, but that is not the expectation. The expectation is about like 16, 17 fantasy points. And sometimes you want more than that. Round 1 of the fantasy playoffs. Also, sit. I like the game. I don't like the fantasy production from this guy. I like that Texans-Dolphins game, but I think it's time that we just sit CJ Stroud most weeks. Consensus quarterback 14 versus the Dolphins. We want 20 fantasy points. CJ Stroud has reached 20 fantasy points in 1 of his 13 games this year. He's currently the quarterback 25 in fantasy points per game. And Miami is a run funnel defense. They are the 2nd worst matchup for opposing fantasy quarterbacks. Joe Mixon might once again take a lot of the red zone goal line opportunities. CJ Stroud really just has burned you 1 time this year. It could happen again. Nico Collins is healthy. The Dolphins just allowed over 300 yards to the Jets. But I'm trying to play higher probabilities here, and simply CJ Stroud has taken a step back this year compared to last year. And I think there's probably a better option for you out there. Running back, sit. Tyrone Tracy, consensus running back 26 versus the Ravens. Giants team total is 13 points. 13 points of offense projected. 5 points lower than any other team this week. The spread is 16.5. LOL. I mean, I don't know what else to say. I think that is the lowest that is the lowest team total I've seen of the year. That is the widest margin. Ravens projected to win by 16.5 on the entire season. Brutal situation. Tommy DeVito getting the start at quarterback instead of Drew Lock. Betting markets are plus 200 anytime touchdown for Tyrone Tracy. That is a 33% chance. That's terrible. 1 in 3 games, they think Tracy scores here. I really just don't see much upside here. No teams on bye. You should have better options for your team. Another one, sit DeAndre Swift. Consensus running back 28 at the Vikings. He had 9.5 fantasy points, just 30 rushing yards when he played the Vikings 3 weeks ago. Vikings are the 3rd worst matchup for fantasy running backs. Roschon's probably returning. You got Roschon Johnson back from his concussion. That will cut into Swift's workload once again. It's just not the spot to start him. Tough matchup. 0 teams on bye. Receiver, I've got 1 name. You probably guessed it based on Tyrone Tracy. I'm sitting Malik Nabers. Consensus wide receiver 23 versus the Ravens. I currently have Malik Nabers in the wide receiver 30 range in my own fantasy rankings. We've got Tommy DeVito at quarterback. Nabers anytime touchdown is around a 30% chance in the betting markets, even lower than Tracy. Nabers reaching 100 yards is priced around a 20% chance of happening. It's so bad. Nabers, he played with DeVito once earlier this year. It was fine. 9 targets, 6 catches, 64 yards. But that was against Tampa Bay. Ravens are a better overall defense that's actually started to play well the past few weeks. Really, they've allowed 2 huge games to Jamar Chase specifically. Other than that, Ravens done an okay job. They're well rested. They're coming off their bye. As I mentioned with Tyrone Tracy, the team totals 13 points. This is projected to be the most brutal offensive environment of the season is Tommy DeVito's Giants against a well-rested Ravens defense. At tight end, I've got a controversial one. I'm sitting Tucker Kraft. I'm actually doing it in a couple leagues. I'm truly sitting him. I'm not just telling you to sit him. Tucker Kraft is the consensus tight end 9 this week. Wild at the Seahawks. Wild. Romeo Doubs should return. That's more target earners in this offense. The Seattle defense has been playing well recently. Tucker Kraft is having the lesser version of the 2023 Sam Laporta rookie season. It's touchdowns. Tucker Kraft has 7 touchdowns on 39 receptions. He's only caught 39 passes, 7 touchdowns. Every 5.5 catches is a touchdown. But he's gone over 4 catches in only 2 of 13 games. This is a touchdown-dependent fantasy option, not a must-start top 12 guy. Folks, we made it. Let's hit you with some underdog fantasy picks. I've got 3 hires for you. I'm in a good mood on this Friday morning. I've got my coffee with me. Those watching live, it is the famous Etsy-made Tyrannosaurus Rex mug. A relative got that for me many years ago because they know I have a T-Rex tattoo. They know I'm obsessed with dinosaurs. Makes me very, very cool. My girlfriend loves that. She loves when I share how much I love dinosaurs on this podcast. 3 underdog fantasy picks for the good people. We got the starts. We got the sits. Here's the picks. Aaron Jones. We talked about him earlier. Aaron Jones, higher 62.5 rushing yards. He's been higher in 8 of 13 games, 62% this year. Great matchup against the Bears. Vikings are touchdown favorites. It's a good game script for Monday night. Bears are allowing 116 rushing yards per game at 5 yards per carry to running backs. Number 2, Khalil Shakir. Higher, 54.5 receiving yards. He's had at least 54 yards in 8 of 12, 67% of his games this year. Now he's got the dream matchup versus the Lions. They struggle against the slot. It's an indoor matchup with a 54.5 point over under game total. And finally, we keep it simple. AdamThielan. Higher, 4.5 receptions. He had 3 catches for 57 yards in his return from injured reserve, playing limited snaps in week 12. Week 13, 10 targets, 8 catches. Week 14, 11 targets, 9 catches versus the Eagles. I think he gets you 5 catches against the Cowboys this week. Folks, I'm Josh Larkey. This is the Dominator. Make sure you are staying tuned. We've got the 200th episode. The 200th episode of Wake and Take is coming right up. Folks, stay with it. I'm Josh Larkey. This is the Dominator. This is for Player Profiler. Thank you, everyone.
Hey, I want to thank you for being part of this broadcast. If you have any thoughts on it, leave a comment. If you enjoyed it, make sure you leave a like. And if you want to see more shows on the Player Profiler channel, subscribe to it. That's how we know you want more.